Night settled quietly over the narrow streets of South Philadelphia, the kind of silence that never truly meant peace. Streetlights hummed above cracked sidewalks, casting long amber shadows that stretched across brick row houses and shuttered storefronts. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed low and lonely, like a warning carried through time. Frank Sheeran did not grow up dreaming of power, money, or violence. His earliest memories were shaped by discipline, routine, and the heavy presence of a strict father who believed that strength was the only shield a boy could carry into the world. Childhood felt less like innocence and more like preparation for hardship, for endurance, for a life where softness could be dangerous. The America of his youth was still learning how to stand after the Great Depression. Families survived through grit, sacrifice, and long hours of work that left little room for comfort. In neighborhoods like Frank's, respect was not given freely. It was earned slowly, sometimes painfully, and often through silence rather than words. Silence became Frank's first language. He learned early that speaking less meant listening more. Listening meant understanding, and understanding in certain streets could mean survival. While other boys chased games and laughter, Frank watched people, how they moved, how they argued, how quickly kindness could disappear when pride was threatened. These quiet observations would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping choices he did not yet know he would face. Then came war. World War II did not arrive gently. It pulled young men from ordinary streets and placed them into landscapes filled with fear, noise, and impossible decisions. For Frank, the battlefield became a harsh classroom where hesitation could cost lives. Days blurred into cold marches, distant gunfire, and orders that demanded obedience without question. War changes people in ways that cannot always be seen. Some returned home with visible scars. Others carried wounds buried deep beneath calm expressions. Frank learned to move forward no matter what stood in front of him. He learned that emotion could interfere with survival. Most of all, he learned how easily life could end and how quickly the world continued afterward. When the war finally released him, America looked different. The streets were familiar, but something inside him had shifted. Peace felt quieter than expected, almost unsettling. Ordinary routines work. Meals, conversations seemed distant compared to the intensity he had known overseas. Like many veterans, he searched for direction. Jobs came and went. Truck driving offered movement, independence, and long hours on empty highways where thoughts could stretch as far as the road ahead. The steady rhythm of tires against asphalt created space to think, or sometimes to avoid thinking altogether. Deliveries, schedules, and routes formed a predictable pattern, something close to control. But the post-war years held another reality beneath the surface. Organized crime was not just a rumor whispered in dark corners. In many cities, it operated quietly alongside everyday business, woven into unions, transportation, and commerce. Power did not always appear loud or obvious. Often it looked calm, polite, even respectable. Frank did not step into that world all at once. At first, it was only small conversations, familiar faces, simple favors that did not seem important. Nothing dramatic, nothing that felt permanent. Just moments that slowly connected, like threads forming a pattern too subtle to notice until it was already complete. This is how many dangerous paths begin not with a single decision, but with a series of ordinary ones. The people Frank encountered were careful, patient, and observant. They valued loyalty above all else. Not the loud kind of loyalty spoken in promises, but the quiet kind proven through action. Trust was measured slowly, and once broken it rarely returned. For a man shaped by war and silence, this world felt strangely understandable. Yet understanding does not mean innocence. Each step forward carried weight, even when it felt small. Each favor created expectation. Each connection reduced the distance between ordinary life and something far more complicated. The road ahead was not marked with warning signs. It looked smooth, steady, and manageable until it wasn't. What makes a person cross that invisible line? Sometimes it is survival, sometimes pride, sometimes the simple desire to belong somewhere after feeling lost. Frank's journey was not built in a single moment of darkness. It formed slowly, shaped by time, experience, and choices that seemed reasonable when viewed one at a time. Only later would the full picture become clear. And clarity, when it finally arrives, often comes too late. The cities of the 1950s were changing. Industry expanded, money flowed through new channels. Influence gathered in quiet rooms where decisions affected thousands of lives without ever appearing in public view. Men who understood power learned to stay invisible. Men who did not rarely lasted long. Frank continued driving, continuing working, continuing moving forward as if motion itself could prevent the past from catching up. But the road he traveled was leading somewhere specific, whether he realized it or not. Every long journey has a beginning that seems ordinary. A meeting, a favor, a conversation that feels unimportant at the time. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. One evening, under a fading sky painted in deep blue and distant orange, Frank stood beside his truck, listening to the quiet hum of the city settling into night. Nothing about the moment appeared significant. No dramatic music, no warning, just another pause in another day. Yet moments like this often sit at the edge of change, because the next step, no matter how small, can alter everything that follows. Frank Sheeran did not yet know how far the road would stretch. He did not know the names that would become part of his life. He did not know the weight of choices still waiting in the years ahead. All he knew was movement. Forward. Always forward. And sometimes, the most dangerous journeys are the ones that feel the most quiet when they begin. Morning arrived slowly over the industrial edges of Pennsylvania, where the sky often looked pale with factory smoke before the sun had fully risen. Truck engines coughed awake one by one, their low rumble echoing across loading yards that smelled of diesel, metal, and damp concrete. For many men, this was only work. For Frank Sheeran, it was something more complicated: movement without questions, distance without explanation, and long stretches of solitude where thoughts could drift unchecked. Driving offered a kind of control that ordinary life rarely provided. The road did not judge. It did not ask about the past or demand promises about the future. It simply extended forward mile after mile, asking only that the driver keep moving. In a country rebuilding itself after war, highways became silent witnesses to thousands of private stories, each one hidden behind a windshield. Frank learned the rhythms of freight and timing, the small details that separated reliability from failure. Deliveries had to arrive when promised. Paperwork had to appear clean. Schedules had to remain predictable. These expectations seemed simple, yet they formed the foundation of trust in a world where trust was often scarce. Trust, however, rarely stayed limited to business. Certain routes introduced familiar faces. Certain warehouses welcomed specific drivers more warmly than others. Conversations began with ordinary topics: weather, fuel prices, long hours, but sometimes drifted toward quieter subjects spoken in lowered voices. Nothing openly illegal, nothing dramatic, just suggestions, opportunities, and favors that sounded harmless when described casually. Frank listened more than he spoke. People noticed that silence in some circles was more valuable than charm. A man who did not brag was a man who might keep secrets. A man who followed instructions without complaint was a man who could be relied upon. These qualities did not guarantee safety, but they opened doors that remained closed to louder personalities. The post-war economy created new power centers that did not always appear in public headlines. Labor unions grew stronger, transportation networks expanded, and money flowed through systems too complex for most outsiders to understand. Influence gathered quietly among individuals who knew how to guide events without drawing attention. Their authority rarely needed to be announced. It simply existed, steady and patient. Frank's work gradually placed him near these hidden structures. At first, the changes felt minor. A request to adjust a delivery time, a suggestion to use a different loading dock, an envelope passed discreetly with instruction. That sounded routine. Each moment seemed small enough to ignore. Yet small moments, repeated often, begin to shape direction. What makes a favor different from a mistake is usually intention. Frank told himself he was only working, only following the expectations placed in front of him. Many men in similar situations believed the same. Survival, stability, and the need to provide could blur moral lines until they looked almost invisible. When choices arrive quietly, they rarely feel like choices at all. Still, the atmosphere around certain meetings carried a weight that ordinary business did not. Rooms grew quieter when particular names were mentioned. Respect appeared instantly, without discussion. Decisions formed quickly, as if already agreed upon before anyone spoke aloud. Power often prefers calm voices. Frank began to understand that some men shaped outcomes far beyond what their titles suggested. They operated through relationships, loyalty, and patience rather than noise. Their strength came from organization, not anger. From planning, not impulse. This form of authority could look almost peaceful until challenged, and challenges rarely ended gently. The world surrounding transportation and labor during the 1950s held both opportunity and risk. Competition for control created tension beneath the surface of everyday business. Most workers only wanted steady pay and predictable hours, yet larger forces moved around the invisible but constant. Frank remained careful in speech, careful in action, careful in deciding when to ask questions and when not to. Carefulness can protect a person, but it can also draw them deeper into situations they do not fully understand. The more reliable he appeared, the more responsibility others trusted him with. Responsibility brought proximity, proximity brought knowledge, and knowledge, once gained, could not easily be set aside. Some evenings ended in quiet diners where coffee cooled untouched while conversations unfolded slowly. No threats, no raised voices, only measured words carrying meanings that outsiders would miss entirely. Agreements formed through nods rather than signatures. Expectations settled into place without being written down. Frank sensed that he was approaching a boundary, though he could not yet see its full shape. Crossing such boundaries rarely feels dramatic in the moment. There is no sudden storm, no clear announcement, only the realization much later that the path behind has disappeared and the only visible direction is forward. Forward into deeper trust, forward into heavier responsibility, forward into a life connected to forces stronger than any single individual. Yet even as these connections strengthened, an important truth remained easy to ignore. Power built in secrecy demands loyalty that can become permanent. Leaving such a world is never as simple as entering it. What begins as cooperation can transform into obligation before a person fully recognizes the change. Frank continued to move through his days with the same steady expression, the same controlled presence shaped years earlier by war. Outwardly calm, inwardly observant, measuring situations without revealing what he truly thought. This restraint earned respect, but respect inside dangerous systems often carries hidden cost. Because the more dependable a man becomes, the more he may be asked to prove that dependability. And proof in certain environments is not always harmless. Across America, the late 1950s carried an image of prosperity, new homes, growing suburbs, families building hopeful futures. Yet alongside that optimism existed quieter stories of influence, corruption, and ambition that never appeared in advertisements or speeches. Two versions of the country moved side by side, rarely acknowledging each other directly. Frank stood between those versions without fully belonging to either one. He was still a worker, still a driver, still a man searching for stability after years of uncertainty. But he was also becoming something else, someone trusted by people whose expectations extended far beyond ordinary employment. Transformation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it unfolds in silence, step by step, until the old life feels distant and unfamiliar. One night, parked beneath a dim warehouse light, Frank watched shadows stretch across stacked cargo while distant traffic whispered along the highway. The scene looked ordinary, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm rested decisions already made and others still waiting ahead. The road continued forward, as it always had, but now it was leading toward quiet power, the kind that changes lives without ever raising its voice. And once a person travels far enough down that road, turning back becomes harder than anyone expects. Cities reveal their true nature after dark. Daytime noise fades, storefront lights dim, and the movement of ordinary business gives way to something slower and more deliberate. In those late hours, conversations become careful, footsteps sound louder, and even the air feels heavier with unspoken meaning. For men whose lives move close to hidden power, night is not a time for rest. It is a time when choices are made quietly, away from the view of the world. Frank Sheeran had grown used to long hours and uncertain schedules. Work no longer followed the simple pattern of pickup and delivery. Instead, timing depended on people rather than clocks, and instructions often arrived without explanation. The change felt gradual, almost natural, yet it carried a seriousness that could not be ignored. Responsibility has a way of announcing itself without words. The individuals surrounding Frank valued reliability above everything else. They paid attention to small details, how a person spoke, how he handled pressure, whether he remained calm when plans shifted unexpectedly. These observations formed silent judgments that determined who could be trusted and who would remain on the outside. Trust, once earned, rarely stayed simple. It asked for patience. It asked for loyalty. Eventually, it asked for proof. Proof did not always appear dramatic. Sometimes it looked like nothing more than being present at the right moment, saying the right thing, or staying silent when silence mattered most. Yet each test carried meaning far beyond its surface. Passing one expectation often led to another, deeper and more permanent. Frank understood that he was being measured, though the rules of measurement were never spoken aloud. Years earlier, survival had depended on rating danger before it arrived. That same awareness now guided him through rooms filled with calm voices and steady eyes. He sensed when tension existed, even when no one acknowledged it. He noticed how quickly respect could shift if someone hesitated. Hesitation, in certain worlds, is seen as weakness, and weakness invites consequences. Still, the environment surrounding these quiet decisions did not resemble the violence often imagined by outsiders. Most moments felt controlled, almost ordinary. Coffee cups rested on tables. Jackets hung neatly on chairs. Conversations unfolded in polite tones. The absence of chaos created an illusion of safety, making the reality beneath it harder to recognize. Power prefers order. Disorder attracts attention, and attention threatens stability. Those who understood influence worked carefully to keep their actions hidden behind routine. Problems were solved efficiently, without spectacle. Conflicts ended quickly, leaving little evidence behind. The goal was never noise, it was continuity. Frank moved within this structure with the same restraint that had carried him through war and uncertainty. He spoke only when necessary, he listened constantly, and he followed directions with precision that did not go unnoticed. To some, he appeared dependable. To others, he appeared useful. In environments built on quiet control, usefulness can become a defining trait. Yet usefulness carries its own burden. Because once a person becomes valuable, expectations grow heavier. There comes a moment when routine tasks no longer prove enough. A deeper level of trust requires deeper action. The shift happens subtly, often framed as opportunity rather than obligation. A request presented calmly. A favor described as temporary. A situation explained in careful, reasonable language. Refusing such requests is rarely simple, not because refusal is impossible, but because relationships complicate every decision. Gratitude, loyalty, and the desire to belong create invisible pressure stronger than any command. A man may tell himself he is free to choose, yet feel the weight of consequence before speaking a single word. Frank sensed that he was approaching such a moment. The signs appeared in small ways: longer conversations, more direct eye contact, pauses that seemed to wait for agreement without asking openly. Nothing forced, nothing threatened, only expectation hanging quietly in the air. Time slows during moments like this. Thoughts move quickly, measuring risk against necessity, future against present. The mind searches for certainty but rarely finds it. Instead, decisions form from instinct shaped by years of experience. Instinct does not guarantee safety. It only guarantees movement. Movement forward changes everything, because once a line is crossed, even silently, the world never looks the same again. For Frank, the realization did not arrive with sudden drama. It emerged gradually, like dawn replacing darkness without announcement. One ordinary evening carried an unusual stillness, the kind that suggests something unseen waiting just beyond awareness. Voices sounded softer. Expressions looked more serious. Even familiar surroundings felt different, as if holding their breath. Moments of transition rarely feel heroic. More often, they feel quiet and permanent. The decision placed before him was not explained in emotional language. It was presented as practical, necessary, and understood. Others had faced similar choices. Others had accepted. Life would continue normally afterward, at least on the surface. Work would remain steady. Respect would deepen. Stability would grow stronger. These promises can sound reassuring, but every promise contains a hidden cost. Frank recognized that cost, even if he could not fully describe it. Some part of him understood that innocence, once surrendered, cannot be reclaimed. The world ahead would operate by different rules shaped by secrecy rather than openness, by loyalty rather than law. Still, understanding does not always prevent action. Human lives are rarely guided by perfect clarity. They are shaped by pressure, circumstance, and the quiet hope that difficult choices might somehow lead to safer ground. Many who step into darkness do so believing they are protecting something important: family, survival, dignity, or belonging. Belief can be powerful, but belief does not erase consequence. As the night deepened and the city settled into silence, Frank stood at the edge of a future he could not fully see. The air felt colder, though nothing around him had changed. Somewhere nearby, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across empty pavement before disappearing into shadow. Life often continues normally in the very moment it is being altered forever. What mattered now was not the noise of the outside world, but the quiet decision forming within him. No witnesses, no applause, only a single choice that would shape everything that followed. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that roads do not choose direction, people do. And once a person accepts a certain path, the distance back to where he began can become impossibly far. The night offered no guidance, only silence, and the steady weight of a decision that could never be undone. Somewhere beyond that silence waited years of consequence, loyalty, conflict, and reflection. None of it visible yet, none of it certain. Only the knowledge that the next step, however small it appeared, would carry meaning far greater than the moment itself. Frank moved forward, not with celebration, not with anger, only with the quiet acceptance of a man who understood that life sometimes closes one door without warning and leaves only a single road ahead. And that road, once taken, would demand more than he could possibly imagine. In many American cities during the middle years of the 20th century, power rarely announced itself in public squares or government halls. Instead, it gathered quietly in back rooms, private offices, and familiar social spaces where conversations moved slowly and decisions carried lasting weight. The appearance of normal life continued outside, families sharing meals, workers finishing long shifts, children playing beneath streetlights, but another world operated beside it, careful to remain unseen. Frank Sheeran had begun to understand how that hidden world functioned. Nothing inside it relied on sudden emotion or reckless behavior. Patience mattered more than speed. Observation mattered more than talk. Above all, loyalty formed the foundation upon which everything else depended. Loyalty, however, is a complicated word. To some, it means protection and belonging. To others, it means obedience without question. In certain environments, it becomes both at once. Frank found himself moving deeper into circles where loyalty was measured constantly, even in silence. A person's reliability was judged not by promises but by consistency over time. Showing up when expected, remaining calm when tension appeared, protecting conversations that were never meant to travel beyond the room in which they were spoken. These expectations created a sense of order that could feel almost reassuring. Structure replaced uncertainty. Clear roles replaced confusion. For someone shaped by years of instability and conflict, that structure offered a strange form of comfort. Yet comfort inside dangerous systems can be misleading, because the same rules that provide belonging can also remove freedom. The individuals surrounding Frank rarely discussed consequences directly. They did not need to. Everyone present understood that trust, once broken, could not easily be repaired. Reputation functioned like currency, earned slowly, protected carefully, and lost in an instant. A single careless action could erase years of careful discipline. Such awareness encouraged silence. Silence in conversation. Silence in emotion. Silence even in thought. Frank carried himself with steady restraint, revealing little and absorbing much. Others noticed that quality and responded with increasing confidence in his presence. Invitations became more frequent. Responsibilities grew more significant. The quiet distance between observer and participant continued to shrink. Still, participation did not always feel dramatic. Most moments remained ordinary on the surface: shared meals, measured discussions, routine planning. The calm atmosphere concealed the seriousness beneath it. Power, when exercised carefully, rarely needs visible force. Influence alone can guide outcomes without raising a single voice. Frank watched how respect moved through a room when certain figures entered. Conversations shifted tone. Attention sharpened. Even silence seemed more deliberate. Authority did not need introduction. It revealed itself through the reactions of others. Understanding this unspoken hierarchy required patience, something Frank possessed in abundance. He recognized which words carried meaning and which were merely decoration. He learned when agreement was expected and when listening was enough. These skills allowed him to move carefully without drawing unnecessary notice. But careful movement does not prevent deeper involvement. Because once trust strengthens, distance disappears. Requests became more personal. framed not as commands but as opportunities to demonstrate reliability. Each task appeared reasonable when viewed alone. None seemed large enough to question, yet together they formed a pattern leading further from ordinary life and closer to permanent obligation. Obligation has a quiet gravity. It pulls slowly, almost gently, until resistance feels impossible. A man may believe he still controls his direction, only to realize that turning away would require abandoning everything he has built. Stability, respect, and connection all become tied to continued cooperation. Frank sensed this gravity growing stronger. At times, he wondered how different choices might have shaped his path. Whether another kind of life had once been possible, whether peace could exist without compromise. These thoughts arrived briefly, then faded beneath the practical demands of the present. Survival rarely allows long reflection. Across the country, the image of prosperity continued expanding: new highways, new homes, new confidence in the future. Yet beneath that brightness remained quieter struggles for influence and control. Two realities moving together, rarely touching, each unaware of how closely the other existed. Frank lived where those realities overlapped. Outwardly, he remained a working man navigating daily responsibilities. Inwardly, he carried knowledge that separated him from ordinary routine. This separation did not feel heroic or powerful. It felt heavy, like holding information that could never be shared freely. Isolation often grows in silence. Even when surrounded by others, a person can feel alone if truth must remain hidden. Conversations become careful performances. Emotions stay guarded. Authentic connection becomes difficult when honesty carries risk. Still, the human need for belonging remains strong. The circles around Frank provided recognition, purpose, and a clear role within an organized structure. These elements can feel meaningful, especially to someone who has no uncertainty. Meaning, however, does not guarantee safety, because systems built on secrecy must protect themselves above all else. Protection sometimes requires decisions that cannot be undone. Decisions explained as necessary, practical, unavoidable. Language softens reality, making harsh actions sound reasonable. Over time, repeated justification can dull moral awareness until right and wrong appear less distinct. Frank recognized this danger, though he rarely spoke of it. Awareness alone does not always create escape. Circumstance, loyalty, and expectation combine to form barriers stronger than physical walls. Days turned into months, and months continued forward with steady momentum. Routine settled into place, disguising how much had already changed. What once felt unfamiliar now appeared normal. Adaptation can happen so gradually that transformation goes unnoticed until reflection arrives years later. One quiet evening, the city air carried the distant echo of music from an unseen radio, blending with the low murmur of traffic fading into night. Streetlights reflected softly against darkened windows, creating the illusion of calm across empty sidewalks. Nothing in the scene suggested danger or consequence. Yet beneath its stillness lived countless untold choices shaping unseen futures. Frank stood within that quiet moment aware, perhaps more than ever, that loyalty had become more than expectation. It had become identity. The path ahead no longer felt temporary, felt established, steady, and increasingly difficult to question. There are points in life when movement slows just enough for truth to become visible, not loudly, not dramatically, only as a quiet understanding that certain doors have closed behind you. What remained ahead was uncertain, but one fact had grown clear. The deeper a person travels into hidden power, the more silence becomes necessary, and the more costly honesty becomes. Frank continued forward with the same measured calm the world had always seen. No outward sign revealed the weight he carried or the questions he kept buried. To others he appeared steady and dependable. Inside, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming continued to widen, and somewhere beyond that widening distance waited consequences no loyalty could fully prevent. Because every circle of silence, no matter how strong, eventually meets a moment when silence is no longer enough. In the public imagination of mid-century America, success looked polished and reassuring. Clean storefront windows reflected orderly streets. Men in pressed suits spoke confidently about business, progress, and stability. Families believed in steady work and predictable futures. From a distance, everything suggested control and comfort, as if the difficult years of hardship and war had finally given way to lasting peace. Yet, beneath that calm appearance, quieter forces continued shaping events in ways most people never saw. Power does not always appear dangerous. Sometimes it looks organized, disciplined, even respectable. Frank Sheeran moved through spaces where this hidden contrast was impossible to ignore. Meetings often took place in ordinary locations, restaurants filled with soft conversation, offices lined with paperwork, social gatherings that seemed harmless to anyone passing by. Nothing in those settings openly revealed the seriousness of the decisions being discussed. The atmosphere remained measured, polite, and controlled. Control was essential. Without it, attention might follow. And attention threatened everything. The individuals guiding these quiet systems understood patience better than urgency. They believed influence worked best when invisible, when outcomes appeared natural rather than directed. Their strength came not from loud displays, but from steady coordination, built carefully over years of trust and shared interest. Frank watched closely, learning without being taught. Observation had always been his instinct. Now it became his protection. He noticed how respect flowed toward certain figures long before they spoke, how conversations adjusted to their presence, how disagreements softened before becoming conflict. Authority revealed itself through subtle reaction rather than declaration. Still, the calm surface concealed a difficult truth. Stability in such a world required constant maintenance. Problems could not be ignored. Challenges could not remain unresolved. Quiet order depended on quiet enforcement, even when enforcement carried more weight that few wanted to acknowledge openly. Frank began to sense how deeply responsibility could reach. Tasks no longer felt temporary or distant. Each action connected to something larger, something designed to preserve influence and prevent disruption. The logic behind these expectations sounded practical, even necessary. Yet practicality does not erase consequence. Decisions made for stability can still carry lasting human cost. Understanding this tension created a silent pressure inside him. Outwardly, he remained composed, the same steady presence others trusted. Inwardly, questions formed that had no safe place to be spoken. How far could loyalty extend before it demanded too much? When did responsibility become burden? And once a person recognized the weight of his path, was turning away still possible? Such questions rarely receive clear answers. Life inside hidden power discourages reflection. Movement forward is easier than stopping to examine direction. Routine replaces doubt. Action replaces hesitation. Over time, the absence of reflection can make even serious choices feel ordinary. Across the nation, opportunity continued expanding. Highways stretched farther, industries grew stronger, and confidence in the future filled newspapers and television screens. Yet prosperity did not reach everyone equally. Some communities struggled quietly, searching for security in uncertain conditions. In those spaces, alternative systems of order could appear attractive, offering protection where traditional structures seemed distant. Frank understood that appeal more than most. He knew what instability felt like. He knew the relief that structure could bring. He also knew that structure built in secrecy demanded a different kind of loyalty, one that rarely allowed easy escape. Days passed with familiar rhythm, but beneath routine lived constant awareness. Every conversation mattered. Every decision connected to reputation. Even silence carried meaning. Living with such awareness required emotional distance, a careful separation between action and feeling. Distance can protect a person, but it can also change him. Frank sometimes noticed how ordinary moments felt strangely removed, as if viewed from behind invisible glass. Laughter sounded softer. Comfort felt temporary. Peace never seemed complete. This quiet detachment allowed him to function without hesitation, yet it also hinted at something slowly fading beneath the surface. Human beings are not meant to live without connection to conscience. When that connection weakens, life may continue outwardly unchanged, but something essential begins to erode. The process is gradual, almost unnoticeable, until reflection finally arrives and reveals how much has been lost. Still, reflection remained distant. Responsibility continued calling for attention in the present, not the past or future. Expectations grew clearer, trust deepened, and with deeper trust came moments that felt heavier than anything before them. Not dramatic moments, not loud ones, only quiet turning points where a single action could define everything that followed. Frank approached such moments with the same calm discipline that had guided him for years. Emotion stayed hidden. Thought remained controlled. From the outside, nothing appeared uncertain. Inside, however, awareness sharpened. He understood that each step forward reduced the distance between duty and consequence. The world around him offered no guidance, only continuation. Streets remained busy. Businesses opened and closed. Families lived their lives unaware of the unseen decisions shaping distant outcomes. Ordinary existence moved forward untouched by the quiet gravity surrounding his path. This contrast created a loneliness difficult to explain. To carry knowledge that cannot be shared, to follow responsibilities that cannot be discussed, to maintain composure while questions remain unanswered. Such isolation becomes its own burden. Yet even within that burden, a person may continue forward simply because stopping feels impossible. Momentum, once strong enough, can replace choice entirely. The road ahead becomes less about direction and more about endurance. One evening, the fading light of sunset stretched across rows of buildings, painting long shadows that blended into approaching night. The scene felt peaceful, almost gentle, hiding every trace of tension beneath warm color. People walked home from work. Cars moved steadily through intersections. Nothing suggested danger or moral struggle. But appearances rarely reveal truth. Frank stood quietly within that ordinary moment, aware that respectability and shadow often exist side by side. The world sees polished surfaces, not hidden foundations. It hears confident words, not silent doubts. It notices success, not the cost required to maintain it. And cost, whether acknowledged or not, never disappears. It waits, patiently, for the moment when silence can no longer hide its presence. Frank did not yet know when that moment would arrive. He only knew that every step forward made it more certain. Responsibility continued growing heavier, shaped by loyalty, expectation, and the quiet promise that stability required sacrifice. Some sacrifices remain unseen by history. Others echo for years. All begin the same way, with a single decision made in silence, believed to be necessary, and carried long after the moment has passed. The night settled fully over the city, softening edges and hiding detail. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting small circles of brightness surrounded by darkness. Within those circles, life appeared calm and predictable. Beyond them, shadows gathered quietly, holding truths few would ever understand. And Frank, standing between light and shadow, continued forward without knowing how far the darkness might reach. Power rarely reveals itself in the moments people expect. It does not always arrive with noise, celebration, or visible force. More often it gathers slowly in quiet rooms where conversations remain calm and decisions appear almost ordinary. To an outsider, such places might seem unremarkable: simple tables, soft lighting, polite voices. Yet beneath that stillness, outcomes form that can shape lives far beyond the walls that contain them. Frank Sheeran had come to understand this quiet atmosphere with increasing clarity. Presence in certain rooms was never accidental. Every invitation carried meaning, even when nothing important seemed to be discussed. Who sat where, who spoke first, who remained silent, each detail revealed a structure of influence invisible to those unfamiliar with its language. Silence in these spaces was not emptiness. It was communication. A pause could signal agreement. A glance could replace a sentence. A calm tone could carry the weight of command. Frank listened carefully, aware that words alone rarely told the full story. Years of discipline had trained him to observe before acting, to measure situations before responding. This restraint allowed him to move through delicate environments without drawing attention, a quality that earned quiet respect from those who valued discretion above all else. Respect, however, is never given freely in worlds built on secrecy. It is tested, retested, and sometimes tested again without warning. The expectations surrounding him had grown more complex, though they were rarely explained directly. Responsibility appeared gradually, like pressure building beneath still water. Each task completed successfully created space for another, slightly heavier than the last. The progression felt natural in the moment, yet its direction was unmistakable: forward, deeper, and increasingly difficult to reverse. Frank recognized the pattern even if he never spoke of it aloud. Awareness alone could not change the path, but it could shape how he walked it. Calmness became essential. Emotion had no safe place in decisions requiring precision. The individuals guiding these quiet systems valued steadiness above enthusiasm. A dependable man who asked few questions could be trusted with more than one who spoke confidently but unpredictably. Reliability, once proven, became a form of currency more valuable than money. Still, currency in such environments always carries cost. Nothing received without expectation, nothing given without purpose. Frank sometimes sensed the invisible balance surrounding every interaction. Favors created obligation. Assistance created memory. Even kindness could become a form of investment, quietly waiting for repayment in the future. These unspoken exchanges formed the true foundation of influence, stronger than any written agreement. Across America, the outward story remained hopeful: economic growth, expanding opportunity, a belief that stability had finally taken root. Families built futures with confidence, trusting that hard work would lead to security. Yet parallel to that optimism existed another reality, one operating quietly beyond public attention. Frank moved within that unseen current daily. He noticed how easily ordinary business could intersect with hidden intention. A shipment delayed for reasons never explained. A conversation that changed direction when certain names appeared. A problem resolved so smoothly that no trace remained afterward. To outsiders, everything looked normal. To those paying attention, nothing was accidental. Understanding this difference required emotional distance. Distance protected judgment. Distance prevented hesitation. Distance allowed action when action became necessary. Yet distance also created loneliness difficult to describe. The more a person separated feeling from responsibility, the harder genuine connection became. Conversations turned careful. Trust outside the hidden world felt fragile. Even moments of quiet reflection carried uncertainty, as if honesty itself might become dangerous. Frank rarely allowed such thoughts to linger. Reflection could weaken resolve, and resolve remained essential for survival in environments where doubt invited risk. Movement forward, steady and controlled, offered the only reliable sense of direction. Time passed with subtle momentum, each day blending into the next while expectations continued growing. Nothing dramatic signaled change. Instead, transformation unfolded through repetition, small decisions accumulating until they formed something permanent. There comes a point when responsibility stops feeling temporary, when turning away no longer seems realistic, when the life once imagined begins to fade into memory. Frank sensed that point approaching, though its exact shape remained unclear. He understood enough to know that deeper trust would eventually require deeper proof. Such proof would not be requested loudly. It would arrive quietly, framed as necessity rather than choice. Moments like that define more than reputation. They define identity. The realization settled slowly, like evening shadows lengthening across a silent street. No sudden fear accompanied it, only a calm awareness that the road ahead demanded strength different from anything before. Strength not of body, but of acceptance. Acceptance that certain decisions, once made, remain forever. One night, inside a softly lit room removed from the noise of the city, conversation moved at an unhurried pace. Nothing appeared urgent. Coffee cooled untouched. Chairs remained still, yet beneath the calm surface lived an intensity impossible to ignore, as if everyone present understood something that did not need to be spoken aloud. Frank felt the weight of that understanding without fully knowing its future. Power often announces itself through expectation rather than instruction. A look that lingers, a silence that waits, a moment stretched just long enough to reveal its meaning. He realized that the path forward would soon require more than quiet observation. Action in some form waited ahead. Not immediate, not defined, but certain. The knowledge carried a heaviness that settled deep within thought, impossible to remove once recognized. Still, outward calm remained unchanged. Control of expression had become second nature, a shield formed through years of discipline. Others saw steadiness. They saw reliability. They saw a man capable of carrying responsibility without visible strain. What they could not see were the silent calculations beneath that calm surface, the awareness of consequence, the understanding of permanence, the quiet question of how far loyalty might extend. Such questions rarely receive answers in advance. Life reveals them only after decisions are already made. Outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Traffic lights changed. Doors opened and closed. Laughter drifted from distant streets. The world moved forward, untouched by the quiet gravity forming in hidden spaces. Most people would never know such moments existed, and perhaps it was better that way. But for Frank, the separation between ordinary life and hidden responsibility had become complete. He now stood fully inside a world defined by silence, loyalty, and expectation. A world where power spoke softly and consequences echoed long after words disappeared. The night deepened, carrying with it the sense that something irreversible was drawing closer. Not visible yet, not named, but approaching with steady certainty. Moments like this rarely offer warning. They arrive quietly, asking only whether a man is ready to accept what follows. Frank remained still, composed, and outwardly unchanged, yet somewhere beneath that calm surface, he understood a truth impossible to ignore. Every quiet room eventually gives way to a decision that cannot remain quiet forever. And when that decision arrives, the echo of power becomes the echo of consequence, lasting far longer than anyone expects. There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning yet divide everything into two separate worlds before and after. These moments rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. They unfold quietly, almost gently, disguised as ordinary responsibility. Only later does their true meaning become clear, when the distance from the past grows too wide to measure. Frank Sheeran had spent years learning how to exist within silence. He understood how calm voices could carry serious intent and how patience could hold more power than anger. The environment around him valued control above all else, and he'd adapted to that expectation with steady discipline. Outwardly, nothing about him appeared uncertain. He moved through each day with the same measured presence that had earned trust over time. Yet trust, when it deepens, begins to ask for something permanent, not immediately, not openly, but inevitably. The request did not come wrapped in threat or urgency. It arrived quietly, presented as necessity rather than choice. Words were careful, almost respectful, as if acknowledging the weight of what remained unspoken. No one needed to explain the seriousness. Understanding already existed in the silence between sentences. Moments like this test more than loyalty. They test identity. Frank felt the stillness around him sharpen, as though time itself had slowed to watch what he would decide. Thoughts moved quickly beneath a calm expression, measuring consequence against expectation. The path behind him, years of quiet cooperation, growing responsibility, and silent agreement, seemed to narrow into a single point. Turning away would not simply mean refusal. It would mean separation. And separation, in certain worlds, carries risks of its own. Human choices are rarely pure. They are shaped by memory, fear, duty, and the desire to protect what feels important. A decision that appears simple from the outside can feel impossibly complex within the moment itself. Frank understood this complexity, yet understanding did not remove the pressure. Silence waited for an answer. He realized that whatever came next would remain with him long after the moment ended. Some actions cannot be forgotten, even when never spoken aloud. They become part of a person's private history, carried quietly through every future day. Still, life inside hidden systems leaves little room for hesitation. Movement forward is often expected before certainty can form. Strength in this environment means accepting responsibility without visible doubt. Whether that responsibility feels justified is a question rarely asked aloud. Frank's decision formed not through emotion, but through acceptance, the same acceptance that had guided him through war, hardship, and uncertainty. He had learned long ago that survival sometimes demands choices no one truly wants. The world does not always offer clean paths. Sometimes it offers only difficult ones, and once a step is taken, it cannot be untaken. The atmosphere around him remained calm, almost gentle, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Conversations continued in steady tones. Chairs shifted softly against the floor. Outside, the city carried on with ordinary rhythm, unaware that a life had quietly crossed an invisible boundary. This contrast felt surreal. How could something so permanent happen in such silence? How could the world remain unchanged when everything inside had shifted? Yet this is often how transformation works. Not through noise or spectacle, but through a single quiet moment that separates innocence from experience forever. Frank sensed the change immediately, even if no one acknowledged it directly. The weight settled deep within him, not sharp or sudden, but steady and enduring. He understood that the road ahead would no longer resemble anything behind him. Responsibility had taken on new meaning, one that could never be explained outside the silence that contained it. Power, he realized, does not only control others, it reshapes the person who carries it. From the outside, nothing about his life appeared different. Routine continued. Conversations remained measured. Expectations moved forward as they always had. Yet beneath the surface, awareness had deepened into something heavier than before. He now understood consequence in a way words could not describe. Such understanding often arrives too late to change direction. Days passed, each one outwardly ordinary, yet colored by the quiet knowledge of what had been done. Memory does not fade simply because it remains unspoken. It lingers in still moments, in reflections glimpsed unexpectedly, in the silence between thoughts. Carrying that memory requires strength of a different kind, the strength to continue living while knowing something irreversible has occurred. Frank continued forward because stopping was impossible. Life demands motion even when the heart wishes for pause. Responsibilities remained. Expectations persisted. The world offered no space to stand still and reconsider. Only the steady pressure to keep moving, one day into the next. He noticed, however, that certain feelings had grown distant. Simplicity felt unreachable. Peace felt incomplete. Even quiet moments carried an undercurrent of awareness that could never fully disappear. This distance did not show outwardly, yet it shaped everything within. Isolation often follows irreversible choice. Not physical isolation, but emotional separation from the person one once believed himself to be. The past becomes unreachable, like a place seen only in memory. The future becomes uncertain, shaped by forces already set in motion. Still, human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. Even the heaviest burdens can become familiar over time. What once felt impossible gradually becomes routine. Survival depends on this adaptation, though it sometimes comes at the cost of something deeply personal. Frank adapted as he always had, quietly, steadily, without complaint. Others continued to see reliability and calm. They saw a man who could carry responsibility without faltering. They did not see the silent distance growing inside him, or the questions that would never again find simple answers. One evening, long after the moment of decision had passed, he stood alone beneath a dim streetlight while the city moved quietly around him. Nothing in the scene suggested significance. Cars passed. Windows glowed softly. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted through the air. Life, indifferent and continuous, moved forward. He realized then that the world rarely pauses for personal consequence. It does not mark invisible boundaries or acknowledge silent transformation. It simply continues, leaving each person to carry his own history alone. Some lines once crossed disappear behind you, not because they were unimportant, but because returning is no longer possible. Frank understood that truth with quiet clarity. The road ahead would demand endurance, loyalty, and acceptance beyond anything he had known before. Whatever remained of uncertainty had been replaced by permanence, and permanence carries its own echo, one that follows a man through every future silence, reminding him that certain choices, no matter how quietly made, can never be undone. Control is one of the most comforting ideas a person can believe in. It suggests that careful planning can prevent chaos, that discipline can shape outcomes, and that strength of will can guide life towards safety. In quiet worlds built on secrecy and loyalty, control becomes more than comfort, it becomes necessity. Without it, uncertainty would spread too quickly, and uncertainty is something such worlds cannot afford. Frank Sheeran lived surrounded by this belief in control. Every conversation was measured. Every action carried intention. Nothing important was left to chance, at least not deliberately. The structure around him appeared steady, almost permanent, as if the future could be managed simply by remaining disciplined enough in the present. Yet life has a way of challenging even the strongest illusions. From the outside, his days still resembled ordinary routine. Work moved forward with predictable rhythm. Familiar faces appeared in familiar places. Voices remained calm, respectful, and careful. Anyone observing from a distance might have seen stability, perhaps even success. Nothing obvious suggested danger or consequence. But inside quiet systems, change rarely announces itself loudly. It begins as tension too small to name, a delay that feels unusual, a conversation that ends too quickly, a silence that lingers longer than it should. Frank noticed these small disturbances with growing awareness. Years of observation had trained him to sense shifts before they became visible. What others dismissed as coincidence, he recognized as warning. Not immediate danger, just the subtle movement of forces adjusting beneath the surface. Control, he understood, was never absolute. It was only maintained, until it wasn't. This realization did not arrive with fear. It arrived with clarity. The world he moved within depended on balanced relationships held carefully in place, expectations managed quietly, outcomes guided without drawing attention. When balance shifted even slightly, the consequences could travel far beyond their starting point. Still, daily life continued. Responsibilities did not pause simply because uncertainty had appeared. If anything, the need for steadiness became greater. Calm expressions mattered more. Careful speech mattered more. The appearance of confidence helped preserve order, even when certainty had begun to fade. Frank carried himself with the same composed presence others expected. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, awareness sharpened into quiet vigilance. He understood that the belief in control, so reassuring on the surface, could dissolve quickly when tested by reality. Human beings often hold tightly to illusions that make difficult lives feel manageable. Safety, stability, permanence. These ideas provide comfort, yet they can also hide truth. No structure, no matter how disciplined, exists beyond the reach of consequence. Time alone ensures that every system eventually faces pressure it cannot fully resist. Frank began to sense that time itself was becoming a factor. Not in any dramatic way, only in the slow accumulation of tension that accompanies hidden power. The longer something remains unseen, the more fragile it quietly becomes. He wondered, though only in private thought, whether control had ever truly existed at all. Perhaps what felt like control was only careful delay postponing outcomes rather than preventing them. Perhaps certainty had always been temporary, waiting patiently for the moment when reality would interrupt. Such thoughts offered no comfort, yet they felt impossible to ignore. Still, reflection changed nothing about the present. Life demanded continuation, not philosophy. Decisions still had to be made. Expectations still had to be met. The world did not pause to allow deeper understanding. It simply moved forward, carrying everyone with it. Frank moved forward as well, guided less by belief in control and more by habit. Habit can feel like safety when true safety is uncertain. Routine provides direction when clarity is missing. Even silence can feel protective when words might create risk. Days passed beneath the quiet tension, each one outwardly calm yet subtly different from the last. Conversations grew slightly more cautious. Observations lasted slightly longer. Even ordinary moments carried a faint sense of anticipation, as though something unseen waited just beyond the horizon. No one spoke of it directly. No one needed to. Awareness traveled silently through shared glances and careful pauses. In environments shaped by secrecy, understanding rarely requires explanation. People feel change before they admit it. They adjust behavior before acknowledging why. Frank felt that adjustment within himself. Patience deepened into watchfulness. Confidence softened into caution. The illusion of control, once steady and reassuring, now appeared fragile, like glass that might crack without warning. Yet fragility does not always lead to collapse. Sometimes it leads to harder attempts at preservation. He saw how carefully others worked to maintain order, to keep uncertainty contained behind calm voices and steady routines. Effort increased quietly, without acknowledgement. The goal remained the same: protect the structure, prevent disruption, continue forward as if nothing had changed. But reality cannot remain hidden forever. Pressure, even when invisible, continues to build, and when it finally reveals itself, the shock often feels sudden, only because the warning signs were ignored for too long. Frank sensed that revelation approaching, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The belief in control had begun to weaken, and once belief weakens, stability soon follows. What remained uncertain was how, and when, the change would fully appear. One evening, standing alone as dusk settled into darkness, he watched the sky shift from soft gray to deep blue. The transition looked peaceful, almost gentle, hiding the certainty that night would arrive whether anyone welcomed it or not. Some changes, he realized, cannot be stopped. They unfold according to forces larger than personal will. Control, in the end, may be nothing more than the hope that tomorrow will resemble today. And hope, while powerful, cannot rewrite reality. Frank understood now that the path ahead would demand something different, not confidence in control, but acceptance of uncertainty. Acceptance requires a quieter kind of strength, one built not on illusion but on endurance. Whatever waited beyond the horizon would arrive in its own time. Until then, silence continued, routine continued, the appearance of stability continued. But beneath that surface, truth had already begun its slow, unstoppable movement forward. And when truth finally emerges, no illusion, no matter how carefully maintained, can stand in its way. Silence can feel like protection. It can guard secrets, prevent conflict, and preserve fragile stability. In certain worlds, silence is not only encouraged, it is required. Words become dangerous, questions become unwelcome, and truth learns to remain hidden behind calm expressions. Frank Sheeran had lived inside silence long enough to understand its power. He knew how carefully chosen words could shape perception, and how the absence of words could carry even greater meaning. Around him, conversations remained measured, respectful, and incomplete. Nothing unnecessary was spoken. Nothing sensitive was repeated. The quiet discipline of secrecy had become part of daily life. At first, silence had seemed manageable, even useful. A simple rule that helped maintain order. But over time, silence began to reveal another side, one far heavier than protection. Because silence does not only hide truth from the outside world, it hides truth from the person carrying it. Frank started to feel that hidden weight in unexpected moments, not during important meetings or serious decisions, but in ordinary, unguarded seconds standing alone in a quiet room, watching strangers pass on a city street, hearing distant laughter that belonged to a simpler life. In those brief pauses, memory spoke louder than silence could contain. He realized that what remained unspoken never truly disappeared. It waited, patiently, for stillness. Human conscience has a quiet voice, but it does not fade easily. Even when buried beneath routine and responsibility, it continues to exist beneath the surface, asking questions that cannot be answered aloud. Questions about choice, consequence, and the meaning of loyalty when loyalty conflicts with something deeper. Frank did not allow himself to dwell on those questions for long. Survival inside hidden systems depends on emotional control. Reflection, if allowed to grow too strong, could weaken the steadiness others relied upon. And steadiness, in his world, was not optional. Still, awareness had begun to change shape. What once felt like discipline now felt closer to isolation. What once felt like loyalty now felt heavier, more permanent. What once felt like control now carried uncertainty beneath it. Silence had not protected him from consequence. It had only delayed the moment when consequence would be felt. Across the country, ordinary life continued moving forward with familiar rhythm. Families planned futures, workers finished long days and returned home to comfort. Children grew without knowing how fragile safety could be. The distance between that visible world and Frank's hidden reality felt wider than ever. He could stand among crowds and still feel separate. He could listen to conversation and hear nothing meant for him. He could exist within life without fully belonging to it. This quiet separation is one of the deepest costs of secrecy. Not punishment from outside forces, but distance from ordinary humanity. The longer silence continues, the harder it becomes to remember what openness once felt like. Frank began to sense that time was no longer moving quietly past him. Instead, it felt as though time itself was watching, measuring, waiting, preparing to reveal something inevitable. The past, once carefully contained, seemed closer to the surface. Memory carried more presence. Reflection arrived more often, even when unwelcome. He wondered, though only in fleeting thought, whether silence could last forever. History suggests otherwise. Every hidden truth eventually searches for light. Every secret eventually tests the strength of those who carry it. Every life built on silence eventually meets a moment when silence is no longer enough. Yet knowing this did not change the present. Responsibilities remained, expectations continued. The world around him still depended on calm behavior and careful speech. Whatever questions existed inside had to remain there, unseen and unheard. Frank continued forward as he always had, steady, controlled, outwardly unchanged. But beneath that calm surface, something subtle had shifted. Silence no longer felt like strength alone. It felt like burden. And burdens, when carried long enough, begin to shape the person beneath them. He noticed how ordinary peace felt unfamiliar, almost unreachable. Even quiet evenings carried tension just beneath the surface, as if true rest required honesty he could never fully allow. The mind, denied expression, searched constantly for escape through memory or distraction. Neither offered lasting relief. Still, he endured. Endurance can look like strength from the outside, but inside, endurance often feels like waiting. Waiting for clarity, waiting for release, waiting for something unnamed to finally arrive. When, late night, long after the city had settled into near silence, Frank stood alone beside a darkened window. Reflections in the glass showed only faint outlines, shapes without detail. Beyond the glass stretched empty streets lit by distant lamps, calm and indifferent. He realized then that silence had given him many things: trust, responsibility, survival. But it had also taken something in return: simplicity, ease, the freedom to live without hidden memory. Nothing in life remains free of cost. Every path asks for payment eventually. The question is never whether a cost exists, only whether a person understands it before it is too late. Frank could not change what had already been done. The past remained fixed, untouched by regret or reflection. But the awareness of cost, clearer now than ever, settled deeply within him. Silence would continue because it had to. Yet he understood that silence was no longer protection alone. It was consequence in its quietest form. Outside, the first faint hint of morning began to soften the darkness. Night was ending, just as it always did, without asking permission from those still awake to see it. Light slowly replaced shadow, revealing streets exactly as they had been hours before: ordinary, peaceful, unchanged. But inside Frank, something had shifted permanently. He now understood a truth that silence had hidden for years. The greatest danger of secrecy is not what it hides from the world, but what it slowly takes from the soul of the one who keeps it. And once that loss is felt, no amount of silence can ever fully return what has disappeared. Time has a way of softening even the hardest reputations, but it never truly erases the weight of the choices that built them. The world around Frank Sheeran continued to move forward with the steady rhythm of factories opening at dawn, trucks rolling across state lines, and families gathering around dinner tables to talk about ordinary worries. Yet inside his own life, the feeling of motion was different. It was quieter, heavier, and filled with moments that seemed to stretch longer than they should. By this point in his journey, experience had carved deep lines into his thinking. Situations that once felt simple no longer appeared that way. Every meeting carried unspoken tension. Every favor hinted at a future obligation. The routine of work, moving goods, delivering messages, solving problems others preferred not to face, continued with outward calm. But beneath that calm lived an awareness that nothing in this world remained stable forever. The neighborhoods he passed through each day reflected the changing mood of the country. Streets that once felt tightly connected began to show signs of distance. Old storefronts closed. New businesses arrived with unfamiliar faces. Conversations in diners shifted from hopeful plans to cautious concerns about money, safety, and trust. These subtle transformations created a background hum of uncertainty that touched everyone, whether they admitted it or not. Frank rarely spoke about such changes, yet he noticed them. Observation had always been one of his strongest habits. He watched how people greeted one another, how quickly laughter faded, how often arguments replaced simple understanding. These details told him more about the direction of life than any newspaper headline could. Quietly, he measured the distance between what the world had been and what it was becoming. Responsibility still defined most of his days. Tasks arrived without ceremony and were handled the same way. Precision mattered, timing mattered. Silence mattered most of all. The fewer words used, the fewer chances there were for mistakes. This disciplined approach had protected him for years, allowing him to move through complicated situations without drawing attention. Yet discipline alone could not answer the deeper questions beginning to form in the back of his mind. There were moments, brief but powerful, when he wondered what a different path might have looked like. Not a dramatic change, not a completely separate life, but something quieter, something built on ordinary routines rather than constant caution. These thoughts never lasted long. Experience had taught him that imagination did not change reality. Still, their presence revealed a shift inside him that he could not ignore. The people around him were changing too. Some grew more ambitious, chasing influence with restless energy. Others stepped back, choosing distance over risk. A few simply disappeared from the daily rhythm, leaving behind unanswered questions and silence. Reminders of how fragile stability could be. Each absence reinforced a truth that everyone in this world eventually faced. Nothing built on fear or secrecy could last forever. Despite this understanding, loyalty remained a powerful force. Bonds formed through shared struggle were difficult to break, even when doubt appeared. Frank believed in finishing what he started. He believed in standing by commitments once they were given. These beliefs shaped his decisions more than emotion ever could. Yet loyalty, he slowly realized, often demanded a price that few people discussed openly. Evenings brought the rare chance for stillness. After long hours of movement and conversation, the quiet of night felt almost unfamiliar. Sitting alone allowed thoughts to surface without interruption. Memories appeared in fragments, faces, voices, moments of tension followed by relief. None of them could be changed. All of them remained part of the same continuous road. Sleep did not always come easily. When it did, it carried dreams that felt less like imagination and more like reflection. Places from years earlier returned with surprising clarity. Sounds echoed. Conversations replayed. These nighttime visions never offered answers, only reminders. Morning always arrived the same way, steady, unavoidable, and indifferent to whatever questions remained unresolved. Public life continued to present an image of control. To outsiders, everything seemed organized and predictable. Business moved forward. Relationships held steady. Nothing appeared out of place. Maintaining that appearance required constant attention, like balancing something fragile that could fall with the smallest misstep. The effort was exhausting, though he rarely showed it. Deep down, a quiet understanding was forming. Power gained through fear was never secure. Respect earned through silence was never complete. Influence built in shadows could disappear the moment light reached it. These realizations did not arrive all at once. They grew slowly, shaped by years of watching how quickly fortunes changed and how easily confidence turned into regret. Yet life did not pause for reflection. New situations demanded action. Decisions had to be made quickly, often without the comfort of certainty. This constant forward motion left little room for hesitation. The road continued, whether anyone felt ready or not. What made this period different was not the work itself, but the awareness surrounding it. Each step felt more permanent than before. Each consequence seemed closer. The distance between action and outcome was shrinking, creating a sense that time was quietly closing in. It was not fear, exactly more like recognition. Recognition that every life eventually reaches a point where past and future begin to meet. Through it all, he remained composed. Years of discipline ensured that emotion stayed hidden beneath a calm surface. People saw steadiness and assumed strength. Few understood that silence sometimes existed not because of confidence, but because words could not fully explain what someone carried inside. The world outside continued its ordinary rhythm: children walking to school, workers rushing to catch buses, neighbors exchanging polite greetings. These simple scenes contrasted sharply with the complicated reality he navigated each day. That contrast revealed something important. Most people searched for peace, not power. They wanted safety, not control. They valued time with family more than influence over strangers. It was a lesson visible everywhere, yet easy to overlook when surrounded by ambition. Gradually, a deeper question began to take shape. What remained when movement stopped? When favors ended? When reputations faded? When the noise of constant activity finally grew quiet? What was left behind? Money could not answer that. Authority could not answer it either. Only truth could, and truth was often the hardest thing to face. This realization did not bring immediate change. Habits built over years rarely disappear overnight. Still, awareness itself marked the beginning of something new. A shift in perspective. A slow turning toward reflection instead of reaction. Toward meaning instead of momentum. The road ahead remained uncertain, but one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Every choice leaves a mark, and eventually those marks form the story a person must live with. No reputation, no influence, no silence can erase that story once it is written. Somewhere beneath the routine of daily life, beneath the calm voice and steady hands, the understanding was growing stronger that real strength is not measured by how much power someone holds over others, but by the courage it takes to confront the consequences of their own past and still choose a better direction before time runs out. Every life carries decisions that arrive quietly, without fanfare, yet change everything once made. They appear as ordinary moments at first: an agreement to do a favor, a quiet promise, a simple act of compliance. To the untrained eye, nothing seems remarkable. But for those who walk carefully in worlds built on loyalty, discretion, and hidden authority, each decision can set a chain of events into motion that cannot be undone. Frank Sheeran had become intimately familiar with this reality. Each choice he made, however small, held weight far beyond immediate perception. The world around him moved with a rhythm that suggested simplicity. Businesses opened and closed. Cars passed down streets, children played, families ate dinner, but underneath, consequences had a gravity all their own. Quietly, invisibly, the ripple of action stretched further than anyone expected. It was not fear that shaped his awareness, it was clarity. He understood that survival depended on measured movement. Impulses could destroy what had been built over years. Hesitation could invite scrutiny. Misjudgment could undo everything. He moved steadily, calculating risks, assessing the subtle changes in conversation, and watching the way power shifted without announcement. In these circles, discretion was not optional. Silence carried authority, while speech could betray even the most loyal intentions. Frank had learned to navigate with minimal words, letting observation guide decisions rather than emotion. Every meeting, every task, every interaction carried subtle cues that required careful interpretation. Reading between the lines was more than skill, it was necessity. Yet even mastery of observation could not prevent the quiet arrival of moral tension. The tasks he performed, the favors he executed, the promises he upheld, each one carved a path that demanded acknowledgement, if not aloud, then within himself. The quiet burden of choice weighed heavily. It was not punishment from others, but the natural consequence of living in a system where every action shaped the future of people he might never meet. The paradox of loyalty was never lost on him. On one hand, it offered protection, purpose, and belonging. On the other, it required acts that separated a person from ordinary morality. Trust demanded obedience. Silence demanded restraint, and responsibility demanded action without hesitation. The deeper the loyalty, the greater the cost. The further forward he moved, the less reversible each choice became. Frank noticed that subtle shifts in human behavior often indicated more than words could reveal. A glance from a senior figure could convey approval or warning. A hesitation in speech might signal hesitation in trust. These unspoken messages, invisible to those outside, dictated every step. To survive, he learned to interpret them instinctively. Failure to read them correctly could carry consequences that no apology could erase. Even in moments of apparent calm, tension remained. Life in these hidden layers did not allow for carelessness. Routine could lull the unwary, but only for so long. Every day presented scenarios requiring discretion, problem-solving, and sometimes action that few outside would understand. Quiet courage became as important as loyalty. The ability to endure consequences that others could not perceive was essential. Frank also recognized that human nature often complicated these dynamics. Ambition, fear, envy all existed quietly, influencing behavior even when nothing was spoken. Missteps often arose not from intentional disobedience but from misunderstanding these hidden currents. Part of his skill lay in anticipating such outcomes, mitigating risks before they escalated, and ensuring that obligations were fulfilled without exposure. Yet despite the careful control, certain consequences remained unavoidable. Every life has moments where ethics, loyalty, and survival collide. Frank knew that some actions, once taken, could never be undone. That awareness created tension, but it also informed discipline. Awareness does not always prevent action, but it ensures the decisions are deliberate, rather than impulsive. In his world, deliberation was the difference between continuation and catastrophe. The isolation inherent in such a life became clear over time. Those outside these circles could not comprehend the weight carried quietly within. Conversations with outsiders had to remain superficial. Friendships could not endure full transparency. Even family remained shielded from the truth. Trust, when it could be shared safely, became a scarce commodity. Loneliness, tempered by purpose, was inevitable. Frank noticed that endurance was not simply physical or mental, it was moral. The longer a person maintained discretion, loyalty, and vigilance, the more profound the inner strength became. At the same time, the moral cost grew heavier. Every compromise, every unspoken act, every hidden decision became part of the ledger he carried alone. Even seemingly simple acts, delivering a message, resolving a conflict, providing protection, contained hidden consequences. One miscalculation could affect reputations, livelihoods, and safety. The farther he moved through the network of hidden authority, the more he recognized that his own life was tied inexorably to the lives of others he would never meet. Responsibility was cumulative, and it demanded constant vigilance. Amid all this, Frank began to understand that not all strength lies in action. Often, true strength exists in restraint. The decision to speak or act when unnecessary could protect far more than immediate intervention. Observing without interfering, waiting until information is complete, choosing loyalty without impulsive judgment, these were the subtle arts of survival. And mastery of them required patience, discipline, and an unshakable sense of internal balance. Time passed in rhythms punctuated by ordinary tasks but underlined by extraordinary responsibility. Streets remained busy, businesses operated, Families planned futures. Life in the public sphere moved forward without awareness of the invisible systems shaping outcome elsewhere. Yet Frank carried those invisible systems within him, constantly aware of the fragile thread on which stability rested. He often reflected silently on the consequences of endurance. To act carefully is not always to act safely. To obey loyalty is not always to remain ethical. Every choice produces a shadow, and shadows grow longer with time. He had learned to accept that some consequences cannot be avoided, only managed. And the management required both meticulous observation and courage in the moment of execution. Quiet nights were rare and precious. During those hours, Frank allowed thoughts to surface without the pressure of immediate action. Reflection arrived with clarity, revealing the subtle cost of each decision. Memory replayed events with precise detail, sometimes forcing uncomfortable acknowledgement of the choices that could never be reversed. Yet even in these private moments he did not despair. Awareness, he realized, was itself a form of control over how he navigated the inevitable consequences of a complicated life. As dawn approached one morning, he looked out over streets, slowly waking to another ordinary day. Children walked to school. Cars rolled steadily along familiar routes. The world, indifferent to hidden decisions, moved forward as it always had. Frank knew that every step he took that day, like every step before it, would leave traces unseen. Yet he also understood that endurance, restraint, and observation would carry him through the path ahead. In the quiet reflection of that early morning, one thought became clear. The burden of choice is not simply what one must do, it is what one must accept. Choices define consequence. Consequence shapes life. And only by accepting both can a person continue forward with integrity, even in the most complex and hidden systems. Frank had reached a point where understanding this truth was as essential as every practical skill he had acquired. Endurance, loyalty, vigilance, and reflection were not just habits, they were survival. And survival required that he continue forward, aware of the shadows that every decision cast, and conscious that every silence he maintained carried its own invisible weight. Influence is not always loud. It does not always announce itself with power, ceremony, or applause. Often it grows in subtle ways, through small actions repeated over time, choices made without witnesses, and decisions that seem ordinary to anyone who doesn't understand the hidden system behind them. To those outside, it appears as luck, circumstance, or mere coincidence. But to someone like Frank Sheeran, influence was never accidental. It was deliberate, careful, and always measured. By now, he had come to recognize the quiet ways in which his presence shaped outcomes. Not through public authority, not through intimidation, but through observation, timing, and decision. Each action carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. A word spoken at the wrong time could unravel plans. A hesitation could alter trust. A missed signal could create opportunity for chaos. Influence existed not in grand gestures, but in disciplined restraint and awareness. Every meeting, every conversation, every simple interaction carried potential weight. Frank learned to observe who spoke first, who remained silent, who shifted in body language, and how these subtle cues interacted with the environment. In such a world, understanding unspoken signals was more important than commanding attention. The quiet man often held the most power because he understood when to act and, more importantly, when not to act. The burden of influence, however, is rarely recognized in the moment. It grows slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day a person realizes the full extent of responsibility resting on their shoulders. Frank carried this weight constantly, balancing loyalty, discretion, and strategy with personal integrity. The choices he made shaped the lives of many beyond his direct observation. Yet each decision was made carefully, without display, without expectation of recognition. Influence also demanded foresight. In systems governed by secrecy, anticipation is critical. One must consider not just immediate effects, but the chain reaction of consequences that will follow. Frank thought in terms of weeks, months, and sometimes years ahead, understanding that stability could vanish if a single element was misjudged. The most effective influence is preventive, not reactive, guiding outcomes before problems appear instead of merely responding afterward. Yet the deeper a person moves into influence, the greater the personal cost. Every decision requires balance between morality and necessity, loyalty and survival, secrecy and consequence. Mistakes cannot always be corrected. Reputation, once impacted, can take years to repair if repair is even possible. Frank had learned to calculate risks, assess consequences, and act with precision. But the weight of influence remained constant, pressing quietly in every choice. He noticed that subtle shifts in human behavior often indicated more than words could reveal. A glance from a senior figure could convey approval or warning. A hesitation in speech might signal hesitation in trust. These unspoken messages, invisible to those outside, dictated every step. To survive, he learned to interpret them instinctively. Failure to read them correctly could carry consequences that no apology could erase. Even in moments of apparent calm, tension remained. Life in these hidden layers did not allow for carelessness. Routine could lull the unwary, but only for so long. Every day presented scenarios requiring discretion, problem-solving, and sometimes action that few outside would understand. Quiet courage became as important as loyalty. The ability to endure consequences that others could not perceive was essential. Frank also recognized that human nature often complicated these dynamics. Ambition, fear, envy all existed quietly, influencing behavior even when nothing was spoken. Missteps often arose not from intentional disobedience but from misunderstanding these hidden currents. Part of his skill lay in anticipating such outcomes, mitigating risks before they escalated, and ensuring that obligations were fulfilled without exposure. Yet despite the careful control, certain consequences remained unavoidable. Every life has moments where ethics, loyalty, and survival collide. Frank knew that some actions, once taken, could never be undone. That awareness created tension, but it also informed discipline. Awareness does not always prevent action, but it ensures that decisions are deliberate rather than impulsive. In his world, deliberation was the difference between continuation and catastrophe. The isolation inherent in such a life became clear over time. Those outside these circles could not comprehend the weight carried quietly within. Conversation with outsiders had to remain superficial. Friendships could not endure full transparency. Even family remained shielded from the truth. Trust, when it could be shared safely, became a scarce commodity. Loneliness, tempered by purpose, was inevitable. Frank noticed that endurance was not simply physical or mental, it was moral. The longer a person maintained discretion, loyalty, and vigilance, the more profound the inner strength became. At the same time, the moral cost grew heavier. Every compromise, every unspoken act, every hidden decision became part of the ledger he carried alone. Even seemingly simple acts, delivering a message, resolving a conflict, providing protection, contained hidden consequences. One miscalculation could affect reputations, livelihoods, and safety. The farther he moved through the network of hidden authority, the more he recognized that his own life was tied inexorably to the lives of others he would never meet. Responsibility was cumulative, and it demanded constant vigilance. Amid all this, Frank began to understand that not all strength lies in action. Often, true strength exists in restraint. The decision to speak or act, when unnecessary, could protect far more than immediate intervention. Observing without interfering, waiting until information is complete, choosing loyalty without impulsive judgment, these were the subtle arts of survival. And mastery of them required patience, discipline, and an unshakable sense of internal balance. Time passed, in rhythms punctuated by ordinary tasks but underlined by extraordinary responsibility. Streets remained busy, businesses operated, families planned futures. Life in the public sphere moved forward without awareness of the invisible system shaping outcome elsewhere. Yet Frank carried those invisible systems within him, constantly aware of the fragile thread on which stability rested. He often reflected silently on the consequences of endurance. To act carefully is not always to act safely. To obey loyalty is not always to remain ethical. Every choice produces a shadow, and shadows grow longer with time. He had learned to accept that some consequences cannot be avoided, only managed, and the management required both meticulous observation and courage in the moment of execution. Quiet nights were rare and precious. During those hours, Frank allowed thoughts to surface without the pressure of immediate action. Reflection arrived with clarity, revealing the subtle costs of each decision. Memory replayed events with precise detail, sometimes forcing uncomfortable acknowledgement of the choices that could never be reversed. Yet even in these private moments, he did not despair. Awareness, he realized, was itself a form of control over how he navigated the inevitable consequences of a complicated life. As dawn approached one morning, he looked out over streets, slowly waking to another ordinary day. Children walked to school. Cars rolled steadily along familiar routes. World, indifferent to hidden decisions, moved forward as it always had. Frank knew that every step he took that day, like every step before it, would leave traces unseen. Yet he also understood that endurance, restraint, and observation would carry him through the path ahead. In the quiet reflection of that early morning, one thought became clear. Influence is not measured by visibility or recognition. It is measured by the effect a person's decisions have over time, often unseen and unacknowledged, and only those willing to accept the quiet weight of that responsibility can navigate it successfully, shaping outcomes while enduring the moral cost that accompanies every hidden choice. Loyalty is often romanticized in stories, spoken of as unwavering, pure, and noble. In reality, it is rarely so simple. True loyalty carries weight, tests boundaries, and demands compromise. It asks for patience, resilience, and the ability to make decisions that others may never understand. It asks for sacrifice, sometimes quietly and sometimes at the cost of the self. Frank Sheeran understood this more clearly than most, having lived his life inside systems where loyalty was both shield and burden, protector and trap. At first glance, loyalty can appear linear. You owe a debt, you uphold a promise, you maintain allegiance. Yet beneath the surface, loyalty interacts with consequence in ways that are anything but straightforward. Every action designed to honor a bond creates ripples, some visible, some hidden. A single favor might protect one person while imperiling another. A single decision might preserve trust with some while fracturing relationships elsewhere. Navigating these lines requires careful observation, patience, and the ability to hold complexity in mind without collapsing under it. Frank's days were structured around these invisible calculations. Meetings, errands, and routines seemed outwardly ordinary, but each carried potential for unforeseen consequence. He observed closely, listening for subtle tones in conversation, interpreting gestures that might otherwise go unnoticed, and predicting outcomes based on the smallest of cues. The world demanded precision. One misstep, one misinterpretation, could have effects that rippled far beyond the immediate circle. But influence alone did not guarantee safety. Even the most carefully maintained loyalty could be challenged by circumstance. People's motivations shift, alliances evolve, and unseen pressures exert force on the system. Frank understood that his responsibility was to anticipate these shifts without being paralyzed by them, to act decisively while remaining acutely aware of the potential cost. Balance between action and restraint became his most essential skill. There were moments when loyalty required uncomfortable choices. To preserve one relationship, he sometimes had to make decisions that would strain another. To maintain discretion, he had to remain silent when speaking might have seemed ethically correct. To act in accordance with past commitments, he occasionally had to accept responsibility for outcomes that no one outside would ever witness or understand. Each compromise carried its own weight, invisible yet undeniable. One of the most challenging aspects of this life was the way consequence follows quietly, often without warning. Decisions made in good faith could yield unexpected results. Actions meant to protect could inadvertently expose vulnerability. Observations intended to maintain stability could provoke tension in unforeseen areas. Awareness alone was insufficient. Vigilance and adaptability were necessary companions. Frank had learned to anticipate the interplay of loyalty and consequence. But even mastery of foresight could not eliminate all risk. Time itself seemed to measure the cost of loyalty. Months passed in a rhythm of careful observation and measured action, punctuated by moments of sudden challenge. Each day demanded attention. Each week reinforced responsibility, and each year reinforced the permanence of certain decisions. Life in these hidden layers was defined less by visible events and more by the unspoken weight of choice carried forward into the future. Isolation remained a constant companion. The nature of loyalty in these systems ensures that only a select few can be trusted, and even then, trust is conditional and situational. Relationships with those outside the circle of influence were superficial, maintained, without disclosure of the deeper realities shaping daily life. Friendships, family ties, and casual interactions existed alongside these truths, but never intersected fully with them. The emotional burden of carrying responsibility alone is a subtle yet profound strain. Endurance is not always visible. It is often tested in quiet moments, hours spent alone reflecting on the implications of actions, nights away considering potential outcomes, pauses in the day when memories surface unbidden. Frank had become accustomed to this endurance, yet it did not diminish the weight he felt. Every decision carried a silent ledger of consequence, and every day added to its cumulative balance. Still, loyalty has its own quiet rewards. Trust, earned through consistency and discretion, generates bonds that are powerful, protective, and lasting. Relationships based on mutual respect and understanding can provide support in ways that casual friendships never could. Frank understood that the same system that imposed weight and consequence also provided stability and purpose. It was a delicate balance, and navigating it required constant awareness. The moral complexity of loyalty also became apparent over time. Actions that maintain allegiance may conflict with personal ethics or broader notions of justice. The tension between personal morality and loyalty is often invisible to outsiders but cannot be ignored by the one living within it. Frank's skill lay in navigating these moral currents, ensuring that his choices upheld the practical needs of loyalty while minimizing harm wherever possible. Observation remained central to his effectiveness. He studied patterns of behavior, anticipated reactions, and adjusted strategies accordingly. Every action had consequences not only for himself but for those around him. Relationships were fragile, and one misstep could compromise years of carefully built trust. The more he learned to anticipate these consequences, the more responsibility he carried. Despite the constant tension, Frank maintained a steady presence. Calm expression, controlled speech, and careful movement masked the complexity beneath. Outwardly, routine continued. Work progressed. Interactions followed familiar rhythms. But inside, the balance between loyalty and consequence was a constant calculation, one that never ceased, even during moments of apparent peace. Even small decisions required careful thought. Choosing whom to assist, what information to convey, and when to act carried layered implications. The consequences of inaction were often as severe as the consequences of action. Awareness of these possibilities shaped every choice, every word, every movement. Each day demanded mental clarity, emotional discipline, and strategic foresight. Frank also understood that influence amplifies responsibility. Decisions made quietly often affected more lives than those made publicly. The cumulative effect of action and restraint defined the trajectory of situations far beyond immediate observation. This amplified the moral stakes of loyalty, reinforcing the need for careful judgment and conscious awareness at all times. In reflection, he recognized that true strength is not the absence of moral conflict, but the ability to navigate it with integrity and awareness. Loyalty, carefully balanced with foresight and reflection, provides stability, but it also carries unavoidable consequence, quietly shaping life in ways both profound and subtle. The path forward is never simple. It is measured, deliberate, and disciplined, requiring both endurance and moral clarity. As the city moved quietly into another day, Frank stood alone for a brief moment, observing the rhythms of ordinary life unfolding around him. Children walked to school, neighbors exchanged greetings, and businesses opened on time. To the casual observer, the world remained predictable. Yet in that ordinary rhythm, Frank perceived the invisible lines of consequence stretching outward from every decision, every act of loyalty, every measured movement he had made. He understood that this quiet weight of influence and responsibility would accompany him indefinitely. The burden of loyalty is not temporary. It does not disappear with age, experience, or accomplishment. It remains, shaping actions, refining judgment, and defining the measure of character. And in that understanding, he found both challenge and clarity, the awareness that choices carry weight. Influence carries responsibility, and loyalty carries consequence. The only path forward is to carry these truths consciously, to navigate each moment with awareness, and to endure the silent burdens that define a life built on trust, discretion, and disciplined action. Power is rarely as visible as people imagine. It does not always announce itself with grand gestures, titles, or public recognition. Often, power exists quietly, operating in the spaces between action and consequence, in the unspoken influence one person holds over another. To those outside, it may seem coincidental or even invisible, yet to those who navigate its currents daily, power is a constant presence, subtle, deliberate, and unavoidable. Frank Sheeran had lived in the realm of quiet power for decades. Unlike the flashy dominance portrayed in films or sensational stories, this power required patience, observation, and careful calculation. It was exercised not through force alone, but through understanding human nature, anticipating reactions, and maintaining influence without drawing attention. This form of power is less glamorous, but infinitely more enduring. Each day presented new scenarios requiring him to measure the impact of every action. A simple conversation could shift loyalties. A decision made in haste could produce consequences that echoed far beyond the initial moment. Frank understood that power is inseparable from responsibility. The greater the ability to affect outcomes, the higher the stakes for both action and inaction. He had long realized that power has a quiet cost. It isolates as much as it protects. Trust becomes selective, loyalty becomes conditional, and relationships with outsiders must remain carefully measured. Normal friendships cannot survive under the weight of unshared knowledge and hidden obligations. Even family interactions are shaped by restraint, as truth and influence must be balanced against potential harm. The subtle nature of power also means the consequences are often invisible until they arrive suddenly. Weeks of careful planning can be undone by a single misjudgment. Efforts to maintain stability may fail when human emotion intersects unpredictably with circumstance. Anticipation mitigates risk but cannot eliminate it entirely. Frank understood that the quiet work of influence is ongoing, relentless, and often unrecognized. Despite this, he did not shy away from responsibility. To wield power effectively requires discipline, a steady hand, and an acceptance of consequence. He moved through his days aware that his actions, though often unseen, had the potential to shape the lives of countless others. This awareness guided his decisions, creating a framework of vigilance that defined his approach to both work and personal life. In public spaces, power is often judged by visibility, aggression, or authority. Frank's experience taught him that true influence is more subtle. It exists in observation, in timing, in the ability to predict and prevent disruption before it occurs. Quiet intervention can protect more than loud displays ever could. Yet, the burden of this silent power weighs heavily on those who understand its reach. Isolation is one consequence of living within this framework. Outward appearances may suggest normalcy, yet the weight of responsibility creates a constant mental and emotional tension. Every action is scrutinized, every word measured, and every decision carries potential consequences. Over time, this tension can create distance from those not involved in the hidden network of influence, reinforcing solitude as both a necessity and a protective measure. Power also tests morality. Decisions that preserve order may conflict with personal ethics. Choices made to protect loyalty may create harm elsewhere. Frank's life had shown him that these moral dilemmas are unavoidable. True strength lies not in avoiding them, but in navigating them with awareness, deliberation, and a commitment to minimizing unnecessary harm. Endurance, then, becomes as important as skill. The ability to maintain vigilance over months and years, to observe subtle shifts, and to act decisively when required is central to survival in this environment. Small lapses can have disproportionate consequences. Attention to detail, consistency, and patience are as critical as courage or physical capability. Frank also recognized the psychological effects of sustained influence. Living under the weight of consequence and discretion can shape behavior, thought patterns, and emotional responses. Habits form around careful observation, strategic restraint, and continuous anticipation of outcomes. Over time, these habits become integral to identity. They are not mere tactics, they are a way of thinking and being in the world. Decision-making under this influence requires constant calibration. One must weigh short-term results against long-term outcomes, immediate benefits against enduring costs. A failure to account for the hidden ripple effects of action can disrupt alliances, destabilize networks, or compromise objectives. Frank's experience had trained him to evaluate each situation with patience and clarity, understanding that sometimes restraint produces more effect than intervention. Even in moments of solitude, the consequences of power remain present. Quiet reflection often reveals both the successes and failures of past decisions. Memory carries the cumulative weight of choices and their impact, reminding him that even unseen influence is never without consequence. This introspection informs future actions, sharpening judgment and reinforcing the discipline necessary to maintain stability. Power also demands adaptability. The hidden networks in which Frank operated were dynamic, shaped by human emotion, shifting alliances, and unpredictable circumstances. Flexibility in approach, combined with rigorous observation, allowed him to navigate these changes effectively. Resistance to adaptation, by contrast, carries risk. Stubbornness or rigidity in the face of evolving circumstances can result in loss of influence or exposure to unforeseen consequences. Throughout it all, patience is paramount. The quiet application of influence is rarely dramatic. It grows through consistency, through trust built over years, and through careful management of action and reaction. The ability to wait, observe, and act at precisely the right moment is more powerful than immediate assertion. Yet patience is difficult, requiring discipline, self-control, and unwavering focus. The cost of power is thus both visible and invisible. It is reflected in relationships strained by secrecy, in the personal burden of responsibility, and in the moral dilemmas that arise from difficult decisions. It is also unseen, the subtle shifts of consequence, the hidden impact of action or inaction, and the enduring responsibility for outcomes that may never be acknowledged publicly. Frank's life demonstrates that influence is not a gift to wield lightly. It requires awareness of consequence, moral reflection, and disciplined restraint. Success is measured not by recognition or outward displays, but by the ability to shape outcomes responsibly, to maintain stability, and to endure the cumulative weight of each decision. Even in the ordinary moments of daily life, the quiet mornings, the unnoticed interactions, the simple movement through streets and buildings, power is present. Its effects radiate outward, influencing others in ways subtle yet profound. Awareness of this power shapes behavior, informs decisions, and demands vigilance, reinforcing the lesson that influence, while often unseen, is never without consequence. Frank Sheeran carried this understanding forward with every step. Each decision, each interaction, and each moment of observation was informed by the knowledge that power is not merely an ability, it is a responsibility. And responsibility, once recognized, cannot be ignored. It defines action, guides choice, and shapes the path of life with invisible yet undeniable force. In worlds governed by hidden rules, observation becomes more powerful than action. The ability to see without being seen, to understand without speaking, and to predict without being told is a skill that develops over time, often without conscious acknowledgement. For Frank Sheeran, observation was not merely a habit, it was a necessity, a form of survival, and a tool of influence. In his experience, those who underestimated the quiet power of observation inevitably faced consequences they could have avoided. Every day presented opportunities to observe. The way someone spoke, the pauses they allowed, the glances exchanged between individuals all carried meaning. To the untrained eye, these were inconsequential details easily overlooked, but to someone attuned to subtle signals, they revealed hidden alliances, intentions, and potential threats. Observation allowed Frank to anticipate situations before they became crises, maintaining stability while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Observation also revealed human nature in its most raw form. People often mask their true feelings, presenting controlled behavior to those around them. Yet underneath, desires, fears, and ambitions persist, often revealing themselves through micro-expressions, hesitations, or deviations from routine. By noticing these signals, Frank could act preemptively, resolving conflicts or making decisions that aligned with broader goals without drawing attention to himself. The challenge of observation lies not merely in seeing but in interpreting accurately. One must differentiate between insignificant behavior and meaningful patterns. Misinterpretation can lead to false assumptions, and false assumptions can carry consequences that ripple outward. Over time, Frank developed a keen sense of judgment, understanding not just what people did, but why they did it, and how those actions might intersect with the hidden structures around him. Observation extends beyond people. Environment, timing, and circumstance also communicate essential information. A change in routine, a new face in a familiar space, or even the subtle rearrangement of objects can indicate shifts in priorities, threats, or opportunities. Awareness of these details allows one to respond strategically rather than react impulsively. For Frank, this meant continuously scanning his surroundings, both literally and metaphorically, to maintain an accurate understanding of the world around him. The subtle power of observation also affects influence. By understanding the underlying currents of relationships and decision-making, Frank could guide outcomes without imposing force. Quiet suggestion, carefully placed action, or even deliberate restraint could achieve more than overt confrontation. Influence exercised through observation is less visible, but far more durable, shaping behavior without immediate recognition and creating stability in systems otherwise prone to volatility. Yet observation carries its own weight. Awareness of human motives, vulnerabilities, and potential consequences brings responsibility. Seeing clearly imposes a moral dimension. When one understands potential outcomes, an action becomes a choice with consequences as tangible as any overt decision. Frank carried this responsibility daily, balancing insight with discretion, ensuring that knowledge gained through observation was applied judiciously and ethically. Observation also cultivates patience. Many situations cannot be resolved immediately. Their complexity requires careful monitoring and measured intervention. The skill lies in waiting for the right moment to act, rather than forcing outcomes prematurely. In Frank's world, premature action often caused more disruption than resolution. Observation teaches the value of timing, reinforcing that restraint is often as powerful as direct involvement. Human behavior is shaped by subtle dynamics that observation alone cannot change. People respond to trust, loyalty, and perceived fairness, often unconsciously. Frank learned to recognize these dynamics and to align his decisions with them, guiding outcomes indirectly rather than imposing them directly. Influence exercised through observation respects the natural flow of events, achieving results with minimal disturbance. Experience also revealed the importance of emotional control. Observation demands detachment. Reacting impulsively or allowing personal feelings to cloud interpretation can obscure essential signals. Frank's training in restraint allowed him to see clearly, assess accurately, and act decisively when necessary. Emotional discipline, paired with observation, created a framework for consistent and effective decision-making. Observation shapes not only action but self-awareness. By monitoring the environment and understanding others, one also gains insight into personal behavior, biases, and blind spots. Frank used this self-awareness to refine his judgment, adjusting responses to align with long-term objectives rather than short-term impulses. Continuous reflection and adaptation strengthened his capacity to navigate complex networks of loyalty, influence, and consequence. The world moves quickly, and the patterns of behavior within it shift constantly. Observation is therefore not static, it is continuous, requiring ongoing attention and adjustment. Success depends on recognizing changes early, interpreting them correctly, and responding with precision. Frank's life demonstrates that the quiet accumulation of insight, applied consistently over time, yields far greater results than sporadic displays of power. Even in moments of apparent calm, observation remained active. A conversation in a quiet room, a passing glance on the street, or the subtle reaction of a colleague could convey vital information. Frank had learned to perceive these signals without drawing attention, to interpret them without influence from bias, and to apply insight in ways that maintain stability while minimizing risk. Observation also reveals the limits of control. No matter how skilled, one cannot predict everything, and unforeseen events can challenge even the most careful calculations. Awareness allows for adaptation, not omnipotence. Frank understood that mistakes are inevitable, but careful observation reduces their likelihood and impact, providing tools to navigate challenges while preserving integrity and influence. In private reflection, Frank often acknowledged the dual nature of observation. It is both empowering and isolating. To perceive deeply is to recognize the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of trust, and the permanence of consequence. It sharpens judgment but also heightens awareness of risk. It allows influence without exposure but requires continuous vigilance. Ultimately, the subtle power of observation is inseparable from responsibility. To see clearly is to bear the weight of knowledge, to anticipate consequences, and to act with discretion. Frank's mastery of observation allowed him to navigate the hidden networks of influence, maintain stability, and exercise loyalty with awareness of the moral and practical implications of every choice. Even as the world outside continued in its ordinary rhythm, streets bustling, conversations occurring, routines unfolding, Frank remained attuned to the invisible currents that shaped outcomes. Observation, subtle and continuous, guided his steps, informed his decisions, and reinforced the enduring lesson: quiet awareness, applied consistently, can be the most powerful force in any life. Truth is rarely absolute in hidden worlds. It is fragmented, layered, and often intentionally obscured. What is said is rarely all that matters. What is left unsaid carries equal weight. Frank Sheeran understood this reality intimately. Over decades of navigating systems governed by loyalty, secrecy, and consequence, He learned that unspoken truths shape more than perception, they shape action, influence, and the trajectory of lives. Each day presented situations where the balance between disclosure and discretion was critical. Sharing too much could expose vulnerability, erode trust, or destabilize carefully maintained relationships. Sharing too little could hinder collaboration, create misunderstandings, or leave allies unprepared for emerging challenges. Unspoken truths exist in the space between these extremes, carrying a weight that is often invisible but unavoidable. Frank's experience taught him that understanding these subtleties requires careful observation and deep reflection. People reveal their intentions through small signals, hesitation, shifts in posture, changes in tone, or patterns of behavior that contradict words. Unspoken truths manifest in actions more often than in speech. The ability to perceive these signals, interpret their meaning, and respond appropriately is central to navigating the hidden systems in which he operated. Maintaining discretion is more than simply withholding information. It is a form of responsibility. Every truth held back or shared has consequences. Even minor disclosures can alter trust dynamics, influence perception, and affect outcomes far beyond the immediate moment. Frank carried this responsibility daily, knowing that his choices regarding truth and silence could protect or endanger lives, relationships, and stability. Silence is not emptiness, it is substance. Each unspoken truth occupies space in decision-making, shaping thought, guiding behavior, and influencing perception. Frank learned to treat silence as an active tool, a way to maintain control without overt intervention. It allowed him to navigate complexities with precision, avoiding unnecessary risk while preserving influence. Yet silence also carries moral weight. Choosing not to disclose a truth often comes at a cost. Decisions must weigh loyalty, ethics, and consequence simultaneously. Frank faced countless situations where action, inaction, or partial disclosure required careful deliberation. Understanding the implications of each choice and accepting the outcomes became a defining aspect of his character and his survival. Observation and patience are essential companions to unspoken truths. Recognizing what is not said, understanding the motivations behind it, and anticipating the eventual consequences are central to effective navigation. Frank honed these skills over decades, learning to interpret subtle cues with accuracy and to act decisively when intervention was necessary. In these systems, foresight often determines survival. Unspoken truths also affect relationships. Trust is built not only on shared information but also on how discretion is exercised. Revealing everything can create dependency, vulnerability, or instability. Withholding too much can breed suspicion or disengagement. Frank's ability to calibrate what to share and what to observe allowed him to maintain alliances, foster loyalty, and prevent unnecessary conflict. The burden of knowledge is a constant companion. Awareness of hidden realities, events, intentions, and potential consequences creates a form of vigilance that shapes behavior at every level. Frank carried this weight silently, navigating each day with careful attention, balancing insight with restraint, and ensuring that his actions supported both immediate stability and long-term outcomes. Even seemingly trivial details can carry significance. The arrangement of objects, a fleeting glance, a brief hesitation, these subtle signals often convey truths that words do not. Frank learned to perceive meaning in these small moments, using them to anticipate challenges, guide decisions, and maintain influence without exposure. The cumulative effect of attentive observation transforms unspoken truths into actionable insight. Moral clarity becomes increasingly important when dealing with hidden truth. Knowledge of potential outcomes carries ethical responsibility. Each decision to disclose, withhold, or act must consider the implications for others, the balance of loyalty, and the broader consequences on relationships and stability. Frank developed a disciplined approach, allowing awareness to guide ethical decision-making while mitigating risk. Unspoken truths also reveal the fragility of perception. Public appearances may suggest order, but hidden dynamics operate beneath the surface. By observing behavior, interpreting signals, and understanding context, Frank could navigate these complexities effectively. Influence in such an environment is less about force and more about understanding, anticipation, and strategic action. Isolation is another consequence of carrying hidden knowledge. Those who perceive unspoken truths understand more than they can reveal, creating a subtle separation from those unaware. Relationships outside this circle must be maintained cautiously, as full disclosure is often impossible. Frank navigated these boundaries carefully, maintaining connections without compromising discretion or safety. The psychological effects of holding unspoken truths are profound. Awareness of hidden consequence creates constant tension, requiring mental clarity, emotional discipline, and strategic thinking. Frank's capacity for reflection, patience, and observation allowed him to endure this tension while making decisions that balanced immediate needs with long-term outcomes. Even in ordinary moments, unspoken truths shape perception. The way people act, respond, and interact reveals patterns that guide decisions. Frank observed these patterns, interpreting them to anticipate changes, prevent conflict, and maintain stability. Silence, discretion, and awareness became the tools through which he exerted influence, demonstrating that power is not always loud, but it is always consequential. Ultimately, the lesson of unspoken truths is that awareness carries responsibility. Knowledge without action can be as consequential as action without knowledge. Each unspoken truth shapes relationships, decisions, and outcomes in ways both subtle and profound. Frank's life demonstrates that understanding these dynamics, exercising discretion, and acting with measured judgment is essential for navigating complexity successfully. In reflection, he understood that unspoken truths define not just influence but integrity. To carry knowledge responsibly is to balance power with accountability, observation with moral clarity, and discretion with foresight. This delicate balance is not a choice, it is a necessity for survival and effective action in any environment governed by hidden rules. Even as the world around him proceeded in ordinary rhythms, streets filling with movement, conversations occurring, and routines unfolding, Frank remained attuned to the unseen forces shaping events. Awareness of unspoken truths guided every step, informed every decision, and reinforced the enduring principle: responsibility is inseparable from knowledge. And the quiet weight of hidden truth shapes life in ways both profound and lasting. Life is not always measured by grand events or dramatic confrontation. Often, it is the quiet moments, the decisions made in silence, the observations carried without announcement, and the responsibilities accepted without recognition that define the trajectory of a person's existence. Frank Sheeran's story is one of this quiet life, a life shaped by discipline, observation, loyalty, and the ever-present weight of consequence. It is a narrative that offers lessons far beyond the immediate circumstances, illuminating truths about human behavior, morality, and the challenges of responsibility. As Frank navigated decades of complex interactions, hidden networks, and unspoken obligations, he came to understand the subtle interplay between action and consequence. Every decision carried potential ripple effects. Every choice had the power to influence outcomes far beyond the immediate moment. And the consequences of those decisions, whether visible or hidden, demanded awareness, reflection, and foresight. Living with such awareness is both a burden and a privilege, for it cultivates understanding that few ever achieve. Discipline was central to this life. The ability to restrain impulse, control emotion, and act with precision under pressure defines success in any environment governed by loyalty and consequence. Frank's experience demonstrated that mastery of oneself is more critical than mastery over others. External circumstances can be unpredictable, but internal discipline provides the foundation for navigating uncertainty with clarity and effectiveness. Observation, too, proved indispensable. To perceive subtle cues, recognize patterns, and anticipate behavior is a form of power that often surpasses physical capability or overt authority. Frank learned that watching, listening, and understanding the environment allowed him to act strategically rather than reactively. Observation provided the insight necessary to protect relationships, maintain stability, and exert influence without unnecessary exposure. Yet, with power and awareness comes isolation. The more one understands the hidden layers of human behavior and consequence, the more difficult it becomes to relate fully to those outside that realm. Friendships, family connections, and ordinary social interactions must often be approached with care, as disclosure of certain truths can create danger or imbalance. Frank carried this isolation with quiet acceptance, understanding it as part of the cost of awareness and responsibility. Moral reflection is another critical dimension. Life in environments governed by loyalty, secrecy, and hidden influence often presents dilemmas where the right choice is not obvious. Maintaining integrity while fulfilling obligations requires careful judgment. Frank's decisions were guided not only by immediate necessity, but also by consideration of long-term, ethical consequences. He recognized that true strength lies in balancing responsibility with conscience, and that navigating moral complexity is itself a skill cultivated over time. Endurance, both mental and emotional, is a recurring lesson from a life lived quietly under pressure. The constant vigilance required by awareness, discretion, and loyalty can create a unique form of stress, one that few outside the inner circles ever recognize. Frank's resilience developed not through confrontation but through repeated, disciplined attention to detail, careful anticipation of outcomes, and the acceptance of responsibility for consequences beyond immediate perception. The subtlety of influence and power in Frank's life provides another lesson. Action does not always need to be visible to be effective. Strategic intervention, careful guidance, and quiet restraint often produce outcomes more significant than overt displays of dominance. The ability to shape events without drawing attention is a mark of true skill, one that requires patience, insight, and discipline. Reflection also reveals the human cost of choices. The weight of unspoken truths, hidden obligations, and moral compromises carries both emotional and psychological effects. Awareness of these burdens is necessary to navigate them effectively. Frank's life illustrates that understanding consequence, accepting responsibility, and exercising discretion are not merely tactical skills, they are essential for preserving stability, integrity, and self-respect. Despite the challenges, there is a profound lesson in perseverance. Life's trajectory is rarely linear, and outcomes often depend on the careful accumulation of small, consistent decisions rather than singular dramatic events. Frank's decades of careful observation, disciplined action, and moral consideration demonstrate that sustained effort, patience, and awareness are essential for long-term effectiveness. Success is rarely public. It is the product of quiet, deliberate choices made consistently over time. The story of a quiet life governed by responsibility also underscores the importance of learning from experience. Each encounter, observation, and decision provides insight that informs future action. Awareness of patterns, recognition of human motivations, and anticipation of consequence are skills refined over years. Frank's ability to integrate these lessons allowed him to navigate complexity with both prudence and effectiveness. Even as ordinary life continued around him, streets filled with movement, businesses operating predictably, families engaged in routine, Frank remained attuned to subtle currents of influence and consequence. His perspective provides a broader understanding of how responsibility, observation, and loyalty operate in everyday contexts. Awareness, he realized, is not just about avoiding mistakes, it is about cultivating the insight and discipline necessary to act wisely under conditions of uncertainty. Ultimately, the life Frank led emphasizes that every choice carries significance. Even decisions that seem minor can have far-reaching effects. Recognizing this truth fosters careful deliberation, strengthens ethical awareness, and encourages patience. Life's quiet moments, the decisions made without fanfare, the observations held in silence, the restraint exercised shape outcomes as profoundly as any visible action. Frank's journey also illustrates the importance of reflection. Taking the time to review decisions, understand consequences, and learn from experience enhances judgment, improves decision-making, and reinforces the discipline required to navigate complex systems. Reflection transforms experience into insight, and insight into actionable wisdom. Finally, the enduring lesson of a life spent in quiet observation, disciplined action, and careful reflection is that responsibility, loyalty, and moral awareness define the measure of character. Strength lies not in outward displays of power, but in the ability to navigate complexity with integrity, foresight, and patience. The quiet life is not easy, but it is rich in insight, resilience, and understanding. Frank's story serves as a reminder that influence and responsibility are inseparable. Choices, whether visible or hidden, create consequences that extend beyond immediate perception. Awareness, discretion, and reflection provide the tools to navigate these complexities successfully. A life of thoughtful observation, careful action, and moral deliberation demonstrates that true mastery lies in understanding both the weight of decisions and the value of enduring lessons. Even in the quietest moments, the principles remain: patience, observation, integrity, and responsibility. They guide action, shape perception, and ensure that influence is exercised with care. From these lessons emerges the final insight: the value of a life lived deliberately, where choices are conscious, actions are measured, and consequences are acknowledged with clarity. In the end, the story is one not of spectacle but of reflection. It is a testament to the quiet strength of discipline, the power of observation, and the enduring weight of responsibility. And in this quiet strength, there is a lesson for all: awareness, integrity, and thoughtful action are the foundations upon which lasting influence and meaningful life are built.